He didn't go to the gala to change his life. He went because his daughter's school needed a new roof, and they were short 3 volunteers. That's the thing about the nights that rearrange everything. They never announce themselves. They arrive wearing the clothes of ordinary Tuesday evenings, smelling like catered salmon and cheap centerpiece flowers. And by the time you realize what's happening, you're already standing at the edge of something you can't walk back from. Nathan Cole was 32 years old, had $47 in checking, and had just noticed something wrong with the stranger's wheelchair that the stranger's own engineers had apparently missed. He should have kept walking. He didn't. If this story already has you, drop your city in the comments and hit like. I want to see how far this one travels. The Hargrove Children's Foundation Gala was the kind of event that existed in 2 parallel universes simultaneously. In the first universe, it was a fundraiser, noble, necessary, organized by people who genuinely wanted to help kids in underfunded Boston neighborhoods get school supplies, medical care, after-school programs. In the second universe, it was a networking event with better lighting and a more defensible tax category, populated by people who wanted to be seen wanting to help, which was a different thing entirely. Nathan Cole existed in neither universe. He was there because Mrs. Papadakis, who ran the parent volunteer committee at Lily's school, had called him on a Thursday afternoon with the specific combination of guilt and hope that volunteer coordinators had apparently been trained to deploy since the beginning of institutional time. "We're just 3 bodies short," she'd said. "You wouldn't have to talk to anyone important, just help with coats and parking validation." He'd said yes because Lily's school needed the roof fixed and the foundation was one of the donors, and because he had a hard time saying no to things that were straightforwardly good, even when they were inconvenient. That was a flaw, probably. His mother had told him so on multiple occasions. He spent 4 hours doing exactly what Mrs. Papadakis had described, taking coats, stamping validation tickets, pointing people toward the bathroom with a professionalism that required considerably more effort than it looked like. The ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel was all gold light and round tables draped in white linen, and the people moving through it wore the specific ease of individuals who had never had to think very hard about money, which Nathan found simultaneously impressive and faintly exhausting to be around. By 10:30, most of the guests had filtered out. The catering staff was clearing plates. The string quartet had packed up. Nathan was stacking coatroom hangers and thinking about whether Lily had actually brushed her teeth before bed. His neighbor Mrs. Chen had put her down, and Mrs. Chen was excellent but had a permissive streak about bedtime dental hygiene when he stepped out onto the hotel terrace to retrieve a forgotten wrap someone had left on a chair. That was when he saw her. She was positioned near the far railing, her wheelchair angled toward the city skyline in a way that suggested she'd been there long enough to find the exact right angle and had stopped caring who saw her doing it. The terrace was empty except for her. Boston spread below and beyond. The harbor, the older buildings, the lights stacked against the dark water, and she was looking at it with an expression that Nathan couldn't immediately categorize. Not peaceful, not sad exactly. Something more contained than either. He almost turned around. He had the forgotten wrap in his hand, which meant his job was technically done, and there was something in the deliberateness of her positioning, the distance she'd put between herself and the door, that said she wasn't there because she'd gotten lost. But then he got closer, because his route back inside ran past her, and that's when he saw the wheelchair. He'd been repairing mobility equipment for 6 years. He'd started doing it because the shop where he'd worked briefly after his daughter was born needed someone with patient hands and mechanical intuition, and he discovered that he was good at it. Good in the way that had nothing to do with formal training and everything to do with being able to look at something and understand how it was supposed to move and how it was actually moving and what the difference between those two things meant. He'd learned the job properly over time, taken the certifications, built a small client base, and now ran a one-man operation out of a rented workspace in Dorchester that was too cold in winter and too hot in summer and was, if he was honest with himself, the best professional situation he'd ever been in. He saw the problem in the left rear wheel before he'd fully processed that he was looking for one. The lateral bracket was slightly misaligned, not visibly to the untrained eye, but the wear pattern on the tire told the story clearly once you knew what to look for. The frame had been taking asymmetric load distribution for weeks, probably longer. Over time, at the wrong moment, under the wrong conditions, the wheel could slip its track. Not catastrophically, necessarily, but on a slope, or during a sharp turn, or on uneven pavement, it could go bad fast. He stood there for a second, calculating, and then said, without fully planning to, "That's a beautiful view." The woman turned to look at him. She had dark hair pulled back cleanly, sharp features, and the expression of someone who had spent considerable energy calibrating how much warmth to make available to strangers in professional settings. She was, he realized, younger than he'd expected, 30, maybe, and she was looking at him with a particular kind of assessment that he associated with people who got approached by strangers frequently and had developed efficient systems for determining intent. "It is," she said, and her tone made clear that she considered the observation complete. Nathan held up the forgotten wrap. "I work the coat room. Just coming out to grab this," he paused. "Sorry to interrupt." "You're not interrupting anything." Which was technically an invitation to leave, or technically neutral. And Nathan had learned over years of being the kind of person who fixed things for a living that sometimes the polite move and the right move weren't the same move. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I noticed your left rear wheel. The lateral bracket looks like it's been running misaligned for a while. I don't want to overstep, but it's the kind of thing that can cause problems on uneven ground." The woman looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't read. "I have engineers," she said. "I know. I figured they knew, and it was something else. But I've been doing this for 6 years, and the wear pattern looks like it's been going on longer than an engineer who checked it recently would have caught." He stopped. "I could be wrong. I usually say something anyway." Something shifted in her face, not softening exactly, but a slight recalibration. "What kind of problems?" "Lateral slip under load, probably on a decline. Sharp turns could accelerate it." He hesitated. "The chair looks custom. That weight distribution is harder to get right." She looked at him another moment. "You're a volunteer?" "Yeah." "Coat room?" "Yeah." The corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. "Most people who talk to me at these events want something." "I want to go home and check whether my daughter's teeth got brushed," Nathan said. "I just thought you should know." That did get something closer to a real expression. Brief, guarded, but present. She seemed to make a decision about something. "Vivian Ashcroft," she said. "Nathan Cole." She didn't extend her hand, which he understood might be deliberate or might be habit or might be neither. He didn't extend his either. "How old is your daughter?" 7. She's named Lily." He said it the way he always said it, with a smallness he didn't intend and couldn't quite suppress. The small register of someone who loved something they were perpetually afraid of losing. Vivian Ashcroft nodded slowly, looking back at the skyline. "I'll have someone look at the bracket. It's probably a 2-hour fix, 3 at most if they have to rebalance the frame." "Thank you, Mr. Cole." It was a dismissal, delivered politely. Nathan recognized it and took it. He turned to go back inside, the forgotten wrap still in his hand, and he was almost at the door when she spoke again. "You said it was a beautiful view," she said. He turned back. She was still looking at the city, not at him. "I used to run every morning along the harbor," she said. "Same view? I never really looked at it then." A pause. "Now people tell me I'm lucky because I can appreciate it." Nathan stood there. He didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't land wrong, and he'd learned that sometimes silence was the only form of honesty available. "That's a terrible thing to say to someone," he said finally. She looked at him again. The assessment was different this time, less efficient. "Yes," she said. "It is." He went back inside. He didn't sleep well that night, which he attributed to the work conversation looping in his head. Not the exchange with Vivian Ashcroft specifically, but the bracket. He kept recalculating. The wear pattern, the load distribution, the custom frame weight. He'd seen misalignments cause slips before. He'd also seen misalignments that had been structurally introduced, which was a different thing entirely and much harder to prove. He told himself he was overthinking it. He made himself sleep. In the morning, Lily ate cereal and told him at length about a disagreement she'd had with a classmate named Priya over the correct classification of narwhals, which she felt strongly were more whale than unicorn, and which Priya felt were more interesting if you kept the question open. Nathan listened and made the appropriate noises and dropped her at school and then drove to his shop in Dorchester, which smelled like metal and machine oil and the specific cold of a building that had been unheated overnight. His first appointment was a power chair recalibration for an older man named Gerald, who came in every 3 months and spent half the appointment telling Nathan about his garden and the other half complaining about the contractor who'd poured his back patio wrong in 2019. Nathan liked Gerald. He did the calibration and listened to the contractor story, which had not changed materially in 2 years but had acquired several new supporting details about the incorrectness of the contractor's cousin, who had apparently weighed in with an opinion. After Gerald left, Nathan sat at his workbench and found himself thinking about the bracket again. He pulled up what he knew about Vivian Ashcroft on his phone. He wasn't sure why. He told himself he was checking whether she'd actually have someone look at the chair, but that was not entirely true, and he knew it. The search results were immediate and plentiful. CEO of Ashcroft Mobility Systems, a Boston-based medical technology company that had apparently been developing some kind of next-generation exoskeleton system for spinal injury patients, founded by her father, Edward Ashcroft, who had died 3 years ago. Vivian had taken over as CEO at 27, which explained some things about the economy of how she moved through conversations. 2 years ago, there had been an accident, a prototype vehicle test at one of the company's facilities. Vivian had been inside when the system failed. The resulting spinal injury had been severe. Nathan read the coverage carefully. There wasn't much beyond the surface facts. The company had issued a statement. There had been a brief investigation. The incident had been classified as a mechanical failure. A man named Daniel Marsh, identified as both a senior engineer and Vivian's fiancé at the time, had been present and had departed the company shortly after. The coverage described him variously as unable to continue his role following the accident and unavailable for comment. The phrasing was careful. Nathan noticed that. He put his phone down and got back to work. At noon, he got a call from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Cole?" A woman's voice, professional but not warm. "This is Renata Park, personal assistant to Ms. Vivian Ashcroft. Ms. Ashcroft asked me to thank you for your observation last night and to let you know that her chair has been scheduled for a full inspection." "Good," Nathan said. "That's good. She also mentioned you'd provided your name and mentioned your shop. She wanted me to confirm that the inspection service would be performed by your business." Nathan paused. "I'm a one-man shop." "Yes. Ms. Ashcroft's preference is that you perform the inspection personally." He thought about the bracket. He thought about the wear pattern that looked longer established than it should have been if anyone had been checking the chair properly. "Tell her I can be available Thursday afternoon," he said. "But I'll need access to the original specifications if the chair is custom." A pause on the other end. "I'll pass that along." He went back to work, but the thing that had been pulling at the edge of his attention since last night had gotten louder. A custom chair. An accident 2 years ago, classified as mechanical failure. A fiancé who disappeared quietly. A bracket that showed wear inconsistent with the age of the damage, and a chair maintained by engineers who should have caught it. He told himself these things didn't necessarily connect. He was good at telling himself things. He'd been doing it since Lily was born, and the woman who was supposed to be her mother decided that what she actually wanted was a different life in a different city, and Nathan had held a 10-day-old infant in a cold apartment in Dorchester and told himself that the two of them were going to be fine. He'd been wrong about a lot of things, but that particular thing had turned out to be true. He was less sure this time. Thursday afternoon, he loaded his tools and drove to the Ashcroft Mobility Systems headquarters in the Seaport District, which was the kind of building that said money without particularly trying, which was the most expensive way of saying money. The lobby had the specific atmosphere of a place that took itself seriously for defensible reasons. There were display cases along one wall showing prototype mobility devices in various stages of development and framed technical drawings that had been made beautiful through design rather than accident. Nathan looked at them while he waited and thought that whoever did the R&D here actually understood what they were building, which was not always the case. Vivian Ashcroft came out to meet him herself, which he hadn't expected. She looked different in daylight, in her own building, more contained maybe, or not contained exactly, but she wore the space differently here. The terrace version of her had been doing something private. This version had the surface composure of someone who had learned to function at high performance in front of people who were watching carefully for signs that she shouldn't be in charge. "Mr. Cole," she said, "thank you for coming." "Nathan's fine." A slight pause. "Nathan." She said it neutrally, assessing whether it changed anything. "My car is in the garage on level 2. Renata will bring the original specifications. I'll need to see the maintenance records too, if you have them." Something crossed her face. "I do, though they're somewhat irregular over the past year." "What does that mean?" "It means I was told the chair was being serviced regularly by the company's equipment team. I recently discovered the logs don't reflect that." She said it flatly, without visible anger, which Nathan found more telling than anger would have been. Anger was immediate. That kind of flatness came from having had time to absorb something and having decided what to do about it. "When did you find out?" he said. 3 weeks ago." She looked at him steadily. "About the same time, 3 members of my executive board began suggesting that perhaps the demands of running the company had become too much for me." Nathan looked at her. "That's a lot of things happening at once." "Yes," said Vivian Ashcroft. "It is." She led him toward the elevator. She moved the chair with the efficiency of someone who had recalibrated completely and refused to let the recalibration show as loss. Nathan fell in beside her, carrying his tools, and didn't say anything else. In the garage, he spent an hour going over the chair with the specificity that the original observation deserved. He documented everything. The bracket misalignment was worse than he'd assessed by feel alone. The angle was precise enough that it had to have been introduced deliberately, which was a thing he kept having to tell himself wasn't what it looked like, and kept failing to convince himself of. He found 2 other issues. A stress fracture in the left footrest support that looked recent but had been painted over, a brake cable with uneven tension that would cause the left brake to lag a fraction of a second behind the right on a decline. Taken separately, any one of them could be explained by wear and poor maintenance. Together, they told a different story. A story about someone who understood the chair's mechanics well enough to introduce failures that looked like neglect. He photographed everything. He made notes. And then he sat back on his heels in the garage of Ashcroft Mobility Systems and thought carefully about what to say to the woman sitting a few feet away, who had been moving through her own company in this chair for 2 years, and who was apparently only now discovering that someone had been making careful adjustments. He thought about the accident. He thought about the bracket. He thought about a 7-year-old girl who had drawn him a picture this morning of a narwhal and left it on his workbench with a note that said, "For when you have a boring day, Dad," and had spelled boring with 2 R's. "Ms. Ashcroft," he said. "Vivian." "Vivian." He looked up at her. "I need to show you something, and I need you to understand that I could be wrong about what it means." She looked at him with the expression of someone who had already been wrong about a lot of things and had learned to receive new information accordingly. "Show me," she said. He laid the photographs out on the hood of Vivian's car because there was nothing else flat enough in the garage, and he walked her through them one by one without editorializing, the way he'd learned to do when delivering news that people weren't going to want to hear. The brake cable first, then the footrest fracture with the paint over it, then the bracket, with a close-up that showed the angle clearly enough that even someone without his background could see it wasn't random. Vivian looked at each photograph for a long time. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask him to slow down or go back. She was the kind of person who processed information by going very still, and she was very still now. When he finished, the garage was quiet except for the ambient hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of a car on an upper level. "The paint on the footrest," she said finally. "That was done after the chair was serviced. The paint's recent, 3, 4 months maybe. The fracture under it is older, but not much older. Someone introduced the fracture and then covered it. Not to hide it from you specifically, to hide it from anyone who looked at the chair casually. My team checks the chair visually every month. A visual check wouldn't catch it. You'd need to remove the support panel. Nobody does that in a routine check." She was quiet again. Nathan watched her and did not fill the silence. He'd learned that too, that there was a particular kind of silence that needed to finish itself, and interrupting it was a form of disrespect. "How long," she said, "would someone need to know this chair's specifications to introduce these specific failures?" "They'd need the engineering drawings, or they'd need access to the chair itself over time with enough privacy to work carefully. He paused. This isn't improvised. Whoever did this understood the load distribution and the mechanical tolerances. They knew exactly how much damage was enough to create a risk without creating something obvious. She looked at the photograph of the bracket for another few seconds. Then she looked up at him with an expression that was not fear and was not anger and was something quieter and more dangerous than either. I need you to be wrong, she said. I know. But you're not. No, Nathan said. I don't think I am. She put the photographs down on the hood of the car in a neat stack and was quiet for a moment. Then, I had a meeting last Tuesday with my COO, my CFO, and 2 board members. They presented a proposal for a strategic acquisition by a company called Meridian Global, a European technology firm. She paused. They framed it as a rescue. The language they used was, the company needs leadership with the energy and resources to take it to the next level. Nathan didn't say anything. My exoskeleton program is 18 months from market certification. The data is extraordinary. Meridian Global's primary business is defense contract manufacturing and licensed resale of medical patents. She looked at him steadily. If they acquire Ashcroft Mobility, the exoskeleton program doesn't go to market. It gets licensed and shelved or redirected. The people it was built to help never see it. How much is Meridian offering? Enough that 3 board members think it's a better outcome than waiting 18 months for market revenue. Her voice stayed flat. Enough that someone apparently decided 2 years ago that the best way to make the acquisition inevitable was to remove me from the decision-making position. The weight of what she was describing settled into the garage like a third presence. Nathan thought about the accident. He'd read the coverage twice the night after the gala, and then again Thursday morning before driving over. And the more he thought about it, the more the language bothered him. The careful phrasing, the classified as mechanical failure conclusion, the quiet departure of a man who'd apparently been close enough to Vivian to be engaged to her. He said, carefully, the accident 2 years ago. Something moved across her face, a controlled flinch, almost imperceptible. What about it? What was the prototype vehicle? She looked at him with the expression of someone calculating how much to say and to whom. He understood it. He was a man she'd met 4 days ago at a charity gala while he was validating parking tickets. He had no credentials that mattered here, no position, no institutional authority. He was nobody, professionally speaking, in the context of whatever she was dealing with. A testing platform, she said slowly. For the early exoskeleton interface system, it was a vehicle-mounted rig, the exoskeleton prototype connected to an automated mobility platform to test load response and directional calibration. We were running indoor trials. A pause. The platform accelerated beyond its programmed parameters and failed to stop. I was in the connection harness. What was the official finding? A cascade failure in the braking firmware. A software error that the investigation attributed to insufficient code review before the trial was approved. She said it like someone reciting a statement they'd given many times. Daniel, my fiancé at the time, was the lead engineer on the firmware. The investigation found no evidence of deliberate tampering, but it found significant procedural failures on the part of the engineering team. He left the company after. He left everything. Something shifted in her voice. Not grief exactly, but the scar tissue over something that had been grief once. He sent me one letter 6 weeks after, said he couldn't be around what had happened, said he was sorry. She paused. I believed him for 2 years. I had no reason not to. And now? She looked at the photographs again. Now I have a chair with deliberate mechanical sabotage and 3 executive board members recommending I step down, and an acquisition offer from a company that would benefit enormously from the failure of my exoskeleton program. She looked up. Now I have a great deal of things I'd like to understand differently. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He thought about what he was about to say, and whether it was his place to say it. He thought about Lily drawing narwhals. He thought about the bracket and the paint over the fracture, and the careful precision of damage that was designed to look like neglect. The access card, he said. The one from the gala. You said Renata Park would have it. Vivian's expression shifted slightly. What about it? You lost it at the gala. I lose things occasionally. The chair doesn't have external storage. Things fall. A pause. It was my executive access card. It opens my private office, the R&D lab on the 4th floor, and the server room. When did you realize it was missing? She was very still. The morning after the gala. Nathan looked at her. I found it, he said. On the terrace, after you went back inside. I've had it since Wednesday morning. He reached into his jacket pocket and held it out. I was going to mail it, and then you called about the chair. She took the card and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him with an expression that was very different from the one she'd aimed at him on the terrace 4 nights ago. Did anyone else see you find it? No, the terrace was empty. She turned the card over in her hand. Our building security logs every use of these cards electronically. Timestamp, access point, duration. She paused. If someone copied this card between when I dropped it and when you found it, how long were you inside before I found it? 40 minutes, roughly. She set the card down on the hood next to the photographs. The card was on the terrace. Anyone on the event staff, anyone who stepped out for air could have found it first. Nathan thought about that. 40 minutes was enough time to clone an RFID card if you had the equipment with you, which meant you'd have needed to know in advance that there was going to be an opportunity, which meant either someone had gotten lucky or someone had created the opportunity deliberately. Is there a way to pull the access logs without going through your IT department? He said. My attorney has standing access to our security records for governance purposes. Her voice was measured now, the tone of someone switching from absorbing information to processing it operationally. Her name is Claire Sutton. She's been with the company since my father built it. Can you trust her? The question landed plainly, and Vivian took it plainly. Yes, she said. She's the only member of the board who hasn't endorsed the acquisition. Then I think you need to call her. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. He could see her deciding something, not about the card or the logs or the acquisition, but about him. About whether a man she'd met at a charity gala who repaired wheelchairs for a living was someone she could use as a sounding board for something that could unravel a 2-year corporate conspiracy. He understood the calculation. He thought she was probably also calculating what her alternatives were. Why are you still here? She said. You fixed the chair. You returned the card. You've done more than anyone could reasonably expect. She wasn't asking it unkindly. She was asking it the way someone asks a question they actually want the answer to. You have a daughter at home and a business to run. This isn't your problem. Nathan thought about that. He picked up one of the photographs, the bracket, close up, and looked at it for a second. I got into this work because my daughter was born with a slight hip dysplasia, he said. Nothing severe, but she needed a mobility aid for about 2 years while she was small, and I spent a lot of that time being scared that the equipment wasn't right, that I wasn't checking it correctly, that I was missing something. He set the photograph down. I started learning the equipment because I needed to understand it to not be scared. And then it turned out I was good at it, and it helped people, and that seemed like a reasonable way to spend a working life. He looked at her. Someone deliberately damaged your chair. Someone with access to your engineering specifications and enough time to do it carefully. That's not a maintenance failure. That's a decision somebody made about what your body was worth to them. A pause. That bothers me more than I can articulate in a parking garage. Vivian looked at him for another moment. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not softening, but a different quality of attention. Like she was seeing him at a slightly different resolution than she had been. My father used to say that the only people who can afford principles are the people who don't have much to lose, she said. He said it as a criticism of himself. He thought he'd gotten too comfortable. Sounds like he was wrong about that. He was wrong about a lot of things. He was also right about a lot of things. It's very annoying. She picked up the photographs and stacked them neatly. I'll call Claire. Mat papas. Claire Sutton was 61, silver-haired, and had the bearing of someone who had spent 4 decades in corporate law and had very few illusions left about how institutions behaved when money got serious. She met them in Vivian's private office on the 18th floor, which Vivian had swept for listening devices before Claire arrived, something she mentioned with a flatness that suggested it had recently become a standard precaution rather than a paranoid one. Nathan sat in the corner with his coffee going cold and mostly listened while Vivian walked Claire through what he'd found in the garage. Claire looked at the photographs with the systematic attention of someone who had learned to read evidence rather than react to it, and she did not say anything until Vivian had finished. "How long have you known about the maintenance logs?" Claire said. 3 weeks. "You didn't tell me 3 weeks ago." "I didn't know what I was looking at 3 weeks ago. I thought it was negligence." Claire looked at Nathan. "And you are?" "Nathan Cole. I repair mobility equipment. I was volunteering at the gala. Renata mentioned you." Claire considered him for a moment with the same efficient assessment Vivian had used on the terrace, though Claire's version had a legal texture to it. She was not deciding whether he was trustworthy so much as deciding how much of what she knew she could say in front of him. "Vivian trusts you." "She has no particular reason to," Vivian said. "But he's the one who saw the bracket in the dark on a hotel terrace, and his read on the chair is consistent with what I independently suspected after I found the maintenance records, and I don't have a lot of other options right now." Claire accepted this with the pragmatism of someone used to working with available resources. She pulled a slim tablet from her bag. "The security logs," she said. "I pulled them this morning after Vivian called before I came over." She set the tablet on the desk and turned it toward them. "Executive card access. Last 3 months." The logs were detailed: timestamps, access point IDs, duration. Nathan leaned forward to look. He didn't know the building's layout well enough to read the access point codes, but Claire walked them through it. "Your office," she said to Vivian, "accessed 14 times in the past 90 days. All of those accesses are yours, logged against your card's primary signature." She scrolled. "The R&D lab on 4, accessed 31 times. Yours, plus 8 authorized engineering staff." She paused. "The server room, accessed 6 times. 4 of those are yours. The other 2—" She stopped. "What?" Vivian said. "The other 2 access events are logged with your card signature, but the timestamps are from nights you weren't in the building. A Tuesday, 11:42 p.m., and a Thursday, 12:17 a.m. She looked up. "Security footage for the server room shows—" Another pause. "The footage for those 2 nights is corrupted. File error logged at the system level, both nights." The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. "Someone cloned the card," Nathan said, "and knew enough about the security system to corrupt the footage without corrupting the surrounding logs, which would have triggered an automatic flag." "That requires direct access to the security infrastructure," Claire said, "not the kind of access a random employee would have." She looked at Vivian. "This is someone who knows the building's systems." "Adrian knows every system," Vivian said. The name landed differently than other names had. Claire's expression shifted. Not surprise, but the particular settling that happens when a suspicion becomes a shape. "Tell me why," Claire said. "Because Adrian Locke has been my COO for 4 years, and before that he was my father's COO for 6, and he is the single person in this company who could have orchestrated a boardroom push, accessed the security infrastructure, and understood the exoskeleton program's value well enough to know what Meridian would pay for it." She said it levelly, but Nathan heard what was underneath it. Not just professional betrayal, but something older and more personal. Adrian Locke had been her father's hire, which meant this had been building since before Edward Ashcroft died. "He's also the one who approved the maintenance schedule for my chair." Nathan thought about that chain of connections and what it meant for the accident 2 years ago. He thought about Daniel Marsh, the engineer, the fiancé, the man who'd sent one letter and then disappeared. The investigation had found procedural failures on the engineering team, the lead engineer, the man who, if someone had wanted a convenient explanation for a firmware failure, would have been the most convenient person to blame. He said carefully, "The accident investigation. Who ran it?" "External firm," Claire said. "Meridian contracted technical consultants." The silence that followed was a different kind than before. Vivian's jaw was tight. She was looking at the wall above Nathan's head, not at anything in particular, the way people look when they're reconstructing a timeline in their heads, and the reconstruction keeps arriving at conclusions they don't want. "Daniel was framed," she said. It wasn't a question. "We don't know that yet," Claire said, but her tone said she thought it too. He was the most technically credible person to blame for a firmware failure. He was close enough to me personally that his departure after the accident would look like guilt or grief and not raise questions. And he was convenient. Vivian's voice stayed level, but something had changed in it. Some quality of weight, like a debt she hadn't known she was carrying, becoming visible. I believed the investigation. I thought he'd been careless. I let him go. You didn't let him go, Nathan said. He left. I didn't ask him to stay. I didn't challenge the findings. She looked at Nathan. 2 years ago, when I was 3 months out of the hospital and still in acute rehabilitation, and still learning to live in this chair, I read the investigation report and I thought, Daniel was always too brilliant to be careful. And I accepted it. Her expression was very controlled. I accepted it because accepting it was easier than the alternative, which was sitting in that hospital room and considering that the people around me had done this deliberately. Nathan didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. We need the original prototype's black box, Claire said. If the accident was engineered, the vehicle data recorder would show anomalies inconsistent with a spontaneous firmware failure. The platform's behavior before, during, and after the cascade failure would be recorded in the box. That data was submitted to the investigation, but if the investigation was compromised, the raw data would show something different from what the report described, Vivian said. Where is the original prototype? Nathan said. Vivian looked at him. Stored. One of our secondary testing facilities in Quincy. Equipment from discontinued trials is kept for 3 years before disposal. A pause. The prototype was never formally decommissioned because the program was suspended, not canceled. It should still be there. Does Adrian know that? Adrian knows where every piece of equipment in this company is stored. She picked up her phone. But he doesn't know that we know what we're looking for. Claire reached over and put her hand briefly on top of Vivian's, a gesture that was not particularly warm, but was present in a way that mattered. Don't move yet, she said. If he's watching the access logs, and if he's sophisticated enough to compromise the server room footage, he's watching the access logs. Any request for the Quincy facility would flag. Then how do we get there? We don't file a request, Claire said. She looked at Nathan. An independent contractor performing equipment assessment wouldn't go through the standard facility request system. They'd go through the Safety and Compliance Office, which is a separate access pathway. She was very deliberate about where she was looking. If someone had a reason to assess stored equipment for safety disposition review, Nathan understood what she was suggesting. He thought about it. He thought about what he was being asked to walk into, which was a secondary testing facility controlled by a company whose COO had apparently been running a 2-year scheme that had included disabling a vehicle with a person inside it. He thought about Lily and the narwhal drawing and the $47 in his checking account, and the practical reality of being a one-man operation with a shop lease due in 6 weeks. I'd need access credentials, he said, and I'd need a legitimate reason to be there that holds up if anyone checks. The Safety and Compliance Office can issue a routine disposition assessment request, Claire said. I have signing authority. It would show up in the system as standard equipment review, the kind of thing that happens routinely when trial equipment reaches the end of its retention period. She paused. The prototype's 3-year retention period ends in 11 days. So the timing is defensible. The timing is perfect, Claire said, which is either fortunate or something else. Nathan looked at Vivienne. She was watching him with the same expression she'd had in the garage, not asking him to do anything, not framing it as a favor, just watching to see what he decided. I'll need the equipment specs, he said, and I'll need to know what the black box housing looks like so I can identify it if it's not labeled. Vivian pulled a folder from her desk drawer. She'd had it ready, he realized, before the meeting even started, and slid it across to him. I had Renata pull the technical documentation this morning, she said, after I called Claire. He looked at the folder. Then he looked at her. You already knew you were going to ask me this. I was hoping I wouldn't have to, she said, but no, I'm not surprised we're here. He opened the folder. The black box was a matte gray unit, roughly the size of a hardcover book, housed in a shock-resistant casing with a specific port configuration on the lower face. He studied it for a moment, committed the shape to memory, and closed the folder. Thursday, he said. I have an 8 o'clock appointment, so mid-morning works. I'll have the credentials ready Wednesday evening, Claire said. Nathan finished his cold coffee because wasting coffee felt wrong regardless of context, and set the cup down and stood up. He looked at Vivian, who was watching him with an expression that was not gratitude exactly, or was gratitude in something that complicated gratitude, which was the look of someone unaccustomed to being helped without an agenda. My daughter gets out of school at 3:15, he said. I'll be done by 2. I'll make sure Renata validates your parking, Vivian said. He picked up his jacket and his tool bag. At the door he paused. Something had been sitting at the edge of his attention since the garage, since she'd said Daniel's name the first time, and he hadn't said it because it wasn't his place and he wasn't sure it was useful. But he thought about what she'd carried for 2 years, the version of events she'd been handed and had no reason to question. And he thought honesty mattered more than tact. The letter he sent you, Nathan said. 6 weeks after. You still have it? Vivian looked at him. Yes. Hold on to it. He paused. If someone was careful enough to run an investigation the way you're describing, they might have also made sure his exit looked right. A letter saying sorry from a man who'd been told his career and his relationship were both over, and who had no way to prove otherwise. That's not guilt. That's someone who'd been maneuvered into a corner and took the exit that was available. She was very still. I might be wrong, he said. You might be, she said. But the quality of her stillness said she didn't think so. He went down through the building's lobby, past the display cases with the prototype mobility devices and the framed technical drawings, and out into the cold October air of the Seaport district. His truck was 2 blocks over. He walked to it without hurrying, thinking about the black box and the Quincy facility, and what 11 days of retention period meant for a timeline. He also thought, briefly and without letting himself think it too long, about Vivian Ashcroft on the hotel terrace looking at a skyline she used to run past, and about the particular quality of the way she'd said, I accepted it, which was the voice of someone who had survived something by choosing not to look at it too closely, and who was now being asked to look. He got in the truck, turned the heat on because October in Boston was not interested in Mercy, and called Mrs. Chen to confirm pickup for Lily. She's fine, Mrs. Chen said. We're doing puzzles. She told me narwhals are a kind of whale, and I told her I didn't know that, and she's been very pleased about it for the past 40 minutes. That sounds right, Nathan said. He drove back to Dorchester and went back to work, and did not think about Adrian Locke or the server room or the black box in Quincy, because thinking about it would not make Thursday come faster, and he had 3 appointments and an invoice to send and a child to pick up. He was good at compartmentalizing when he had to be. He'd learned it the same way he'd learned most things, because the alternative was not a real alternative. But that night, after Lily was asleep and the apartment was quiet, he sat at the kitchen table and looked at the technical documentation Vivian had given him. He read through the black box specifications carefully. He looked at the port configuration diagram and the housing tolerances and the access procedures. And he thought about a man named Daniel Marsh, who had sent a letter 6 weeks after the worst night of his life saying he was sorry, and had then apparently vanished, and who, if Nathan was reading this right, had been carrying something that wasn't his to carry for 2 years. He put the folder away, washed the dinner dishes, checked that the front door was locked. He went to bed and did not sleep particularly well. Thursday came in gray and cold, the kind of October morning that Boston specializes in. Not dramatically cold, just relentlessly, personally cold, the kind that finds the gap between your collar and your neck and stays there. Nathan drove to Quincy with the credentials Claire had sent Wednesday evening, and the technical documentation folded in his inside jacket pocket, and he drank gas station coffee that was bad enough to be clarifying. The Ashcroft Secondary Testing Facility was a converted industrial building near the waterfront, utilitarian in the way that buildings built for function rather than appearance tend to be utilitarian. High ceilings, concrete floors, wide loading bays, fluorescent lighting that hummed at a frequency that became invisible after 10 minutes and noticeable again the moment you stepped outside. A security guard at the front desk checked his credentials against the disposition assessment request in the system, found it where Claire had placed it, and gave him a laminated visitor badge and directions to the storage wing without any particular interest. Nathan had worked in enough institutional settings to know that the most effective camouflage was paperwork that was already there when someone went to look. The storage wing was long and organized with the specific logic of a facility that cataloged equipment by project code rather than description, which meant Nathan spent 20 minutes moving through rows of shelved hardware before he found the trial section for the exoskeleton program. The equipment was covered in dust sheeting and tagged with retention dates. He moved along the row reading tags until he found the mobility platform, larger than he'd expected, a low-slung automated vehicle frame roughly the size of a golf cart, designed to carry the exoskeleton harness rig at controlled speeds across a calibrated test floor. He crouched beside it and found the black box housing where the documentation said it would be, mounted on the lower rear frame behind a protective panel that required a hex key to open. He had a hex key. He opened the panel and looked at the matte gray casing and the port configuration and confirmed it was the unit described in Vivian's folder. He photographed it in place before touching it. He photographed the seal, which was intact, which mattered because an intact seal meant the raw data hadn't been physically accessed since the unit was last logged, which meant whatever the investigation team had submitted to their report had come from a copy or a download, not from someone sitting in this room and editing hardware. He disconnected the unit carefully, bagged it, replaced the panel, and stood up. He'd been in the facility for 38 minutes. He signed out at the front desk, returned the visitor badge, and walked to his truck. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. The black box was in a canvas bag on the passenger seat. It was, he thought, a remarkable amount of information in a very small package. 2 years of someone's life, the shape of a conspiracy, the exoneration or condemnation of a man who disappeared into a letter that said he was sorry, all of it compressed into a matte gray rectangle the size of a hardcover book. He started the engine and drove back to Boston. Claire Sutton had a contact at the Veritan Digital Forensics Lab on Commonwealth Avenue, a woman named Dr. Priya Okafor, who did data recovery work for law firms and had the professional disposition of someone who had spent 20 years looking at other people's worst decisions encoded in electronic storage and had developed equanimity about it. Claire called her while Nathan was still on the 93, and by the time he reached the city, Dr. Okafor had cleared her afternoon schedule. They met in the lab's conference room, Nathan, Vivian, and Claire, with Dr. Okafor across the table behind a workstation. Vivian had come from the office in a car with a driver because the chair's repair was still 48 hours out, and Nathan had fixed the immediate brake issue but advised against solo navigation in the interim. She'd agreed without making it a negotiation, which told him something about where she was operating emotionally. Some part of her calibration was offline, the part that normally spent energy on self-sufficiency as a statement. She was focused on something beyond the daily performance of being fine. Dr. Okafor connected the black box through a forensic interface that prevented write operations, which meant nothing in the retrieval process could alter the source data. She explained this briefly and technically, and then got to work, and the three of them waited while the interface pulled 2 years of dormant vehicle telemetry into a readable format. "How long?" Vivian said. 40 minutes for the full extraction, Dr. Okafor said. "I can give you a preliminary read on the accident date's data in 15 minutes was a particular kind of long. Nathan got up and found a coffee machine in the hallway and brought back cups for everyone because it was something to do that wasn't sitting and watching a progress bar. Vivian held her cup in both hands and looked at the wall. "Tell me about your daughter," she said. Nathan looked at her. "Lily? You mentioned she had a hip condition when she was small. Dysplasia. Mild. She was in a soft brace for about 18 months and then a lightweight mobility aid for another 8 months after that." He paused. "She's fine now. She runs everywhere. She ran track last spring and came in 4th in her age group, which she considered a devastating personal failure and which I considered extraordinary." Something moved in Vivian's expression. "She sounds like a particular kind of person." "She's 7 going on 43, Nathan said. "She has opinions about everything, and most of them are defensible." Vivian almost smiled. Not quite, but close. "My father was like that. He had opinions about everything from municipal parking to the correct way to load a dishwasher, and he would argue all of them with equal conviction." "Did you inherit that?" "I inherited the conviction," she said. "I learned to choose my arguments more selectively." A pause. "He built this company because my uncle needed a mobility device, and the available options were inadequate. That's the whole origin story. No grand vision, no market analysis, just, This isn't good enough, and I can do better. She looked at the wall again. He died before the exoskeleton program reached prototype stage. He knew the concept, he believed in it, but he never saw what we built. Nathan didn't say anything for a moment. He thought about the display cases in the lobby of the Seaport building, the framed technical drawings, the way the R&D floor had felt when he'd walked past it briefly on Thursday. Purposeful, specific, the atmosphere of people working on something they believed in. He would have, Nathan said, seen it. That's what I'm working toward, Vivian said, not emotionally, practically. Every delay is time that people who need this technology don't have it. That's not abstract to me. I know what it costs to wait. Dr. Okafor looked up from her workstation. I have the preliminary data. They all turned. She had pulled the telemetry from the date of the accident into a visual display. Vehicle speed, directional data, brake system response, firmware command log, all of it plotted against timestamp on a graph that was legible even to someone without her training. Walk us through it, Claire said. The platform was running at nominal parameters for the first 11 minutes of the trial, Dr. Okafor said, moving her cursor along the timeline. Speed steady at calibrated test velocity. Directional commands consistent with the program route. Brake system showing normal standby response. She paused at a point on the timeline. At 11 minutes and 43 seconds, there's a command injection. What does that mean? Nathan said. It means a command was introduced into the firmware control stream from an external source. Not from the platform's own operating parameters, not from the trial protocol, from outside the system. She zoomed in on the command log. The command overrode the speed limiter and disabled the primary and secondary brake systems simultaneously. The room was quiet. That's not a cascade failure, Claire said. No, Dr. Okafor said. A cascade failure would show a sequence of individual system failures building on each other. You'd see the brake system degrading before failure. You'd see the speed increase as a consequence of lost control. What this shows is a simultaneous, instantaneous override of multiple systems from a single external command. That's deliberate remote access. Vivian was very still. The investigation report described a cascade firmware failure originating in the brake management code. The brake system failed, Dr. Okafor said, but it failed because it was told to, not because it malfunctioned. She looked at Vivian steadily. Whoever ran that investigation either didn't have access to the raw telemetry data or they had access and chose to describe it differently. They had access, Claire said. They were given the black box as part of the standard investigation package. The report cites telemetry data. She paused. They described it differently. Another silence. Vivian put her coffee down on the table, and Nathan noticed her hand wasn't entirely steady when she did it, which was the first sign of unsteadiness he'd seen from her. He understood it. Not fear, but the particular vertigo of having a version of events you'd been living inside for 2 years collapse all at once. The command injection, Nathan said to Dr. Okafor. Can you trace the source? Where it came from? The log records the origin channel, she said. It came through the facility's equipment management network, the internal system that controlled the test floor's automated systems. Someone with administrative access to that network sent the override command. She paused. The access credentials used to log into the management network at the time of the command are in the data. Claire leaned forward. Whose credentials? Dr. Okafor looked at her screen. The login is registered to a user ID designated as System Administrator for the Quincy Facility Operations. She read the associated name aloud. It wasn't Daniel Marsh. The user ID was registered to Adrian Locke. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Nathan could hear the ventilation system and the faint traffic sound from Commonwealth Avenue, and nothing else for a long moment. Vivian said, he was at the facility that day. He attended the trial as a senior executive observer, Claire said. She was already pulling something on her own tablet. I have the attendance log from the original investigation file. He's listed as present. She looked up, which means he had physical access to the network terminals on the test floor. He was there, Vivian said. He watched. Nathan thought about that. About a man who had arranged to be present while a vehicle malfunctioned with Vivian inside it, who had stood in the facility and logged a remote command and then waited. What happened to Daniel that day? Nathan said. Vivian looked at him. He was found unconscious in the control room. They said he'd hit his head on the equipment console. The assumption was that he'd seen what was happening and panicked, lost his footing. She paused. He had a concussion. He was treated at the site and then at a hospital. He was conscious and talking by the time I was out of surgery. Someone hit him, Nathan said. It wasn't a question. Claire confirmed it anyway. If the command came from Adrian's credentials, then Daniel wasn't at the terminal, which means his unconscious state wasn't a fall. Someone needed him away from the control room before the command was sent, and needed it to look like an accident. Daniel knew something was wrong, Vivian said slowly. The letter. He said he was sorry. He said he couldn't be around what had happened. She looked at Nathan. I thought he meant the accident, his own failures. But what if he'd found the sabotage before the trial? Nathan said, and tried to stop it and didn't make it to the terminal in time. Vivian's jaw tightened. He would have tried to get to me. He would have. He knew the trial schedule. He knew I was in the harness rig. If he found something and tried to stop it and someone knocked him down before he could... She stopped. She looked at the wall for a moment. He spent 2 years thinking he'd failed me, thinking I thought he'd been careless and let me get hurt. We don't know what he was told, Claire said carefully. I know what the investigation report said, Vivian said. Procedural failure, insufficient code review, engineering oversight. His name attached to all of it. He had no institutional standing left to contest the findings. And She stopped again. I didn't call him. After the letter, I didn't call him. Nathan looked at his coffee cup. He didn't say anything because there was nothing to say to that. It was just true. And sometimes true things had to sit in a room before they could be moved. After a moment, Claire said, We need to find him. I'll look, Vivian said. Her voice was flat again, the operational register back in place. I have his last known address from the HR file. 3 years old, but it's a start. She looked at Claire. Is the telemetry data enough? For federal investigators? It's a significant piece, Claire said, but it's more powerful with corroborating financial records. If Adrian was negotiating with Meridian before the acquisition offer was formally made, if there are communications, wire transfers, anything tying him to Meridian prior to the official proposal, the financial records would be in the company's accounting system, Vivian said, which I don't access regularly because Adrian runs operations. A pause. Which he would have known. I have governance access to the financial audit trails, Claire said. I've been reluctant to use it because if Adrian is watching access logs, he's going to know something is wrong regardless, Nathan said. The black box is gone from Quincy. Even if the disposition assessment explains it officially, if someone checks the storage log and cross-references the timeline, he'll check, Vivian said. He checks everything. Then the window is shorter than we thought, Nathan said. How long before he'd notice the box is missing? If he monitors the Quincy access logs, a day, maybe 2. Claire looked between them. I need to pull the financial audit trails today. If there are communications with Meridian predating the formal acquisition offer, they'll be in the archived exchange records. She was already standing. I'll call you from my office. She left, and the room reconfigured itself into the smaller version, just Nathan and Vivian and Dr. Okafor, who had the professional discretion to appear absorbed in her workstation. Vivian looked at Nathan. You should go get your daughter. It's 11:30, he said. I know, but I'm saying you don't have to stay. This part is legal and financial work. You've done more than... Stop saying that, Nathan said. She looked at him. You've said it 3 times now, he said. You don't have to stay. You've done more than enough. This isn't your problem. I understand what you're doing. You're giving me an exit so that if things go wrong, you can tell yourself you didn't pull a civilian into it. He looked at her directly. But I'm already in it. The exit was available 3 days ago, and I didn't take it. And I didn't take it because what was done to you and what was done to Daniel Marsh is wrong in a way that doesn't stop being wrong because I've met my obligation. He paused. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who can't put this down. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her face, complicated, and then simplified, and then just present. All right, she said. All right, he said. Daniel Marsh was living in Providence. Vivian found him through a combination of the HR file address, a public records search, and 2 phone calls that Claire made from her car in the time it took Nathan to drive Vivian back to the Seaport building. He was working as a software consultant for a small engineering firm. He had not, as far as they could determine, spoken publicly about Ashcroft Mobility Systems since the letter he'd sent Vivian 3 years ago. Vivian called him herself. Nathan was sitting across the desk from her when she did it, not deliberately eavesdropping, but present in the room and making no pretense otherwise. He looked at the framed photograph on the bookshelf. Edward Ashcroft, younger than Nathan had imagined him, standing in front of what looked like an early mobility device prototype and grinning with the specific satisfaction of someone who had just solved something. Vivian's side of the call was quiet, and then very quiet, and then quiet in a different way. When she hung up, she sat with the phone in her lap and didn't speak for a moment. "He's coming," she said finally. "He'll be here by 6. "What did he say?" She looked out the window at the harbor. "He said he's been waiting for someone to call." She paused. "He said he knew." That day, he'd found an anomaly in the facility's network access logs 2 days before the trial. Someone had run a test command through the equipment management system at 3 in the morning using administrative credentials. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it was wrong, and he'd been trying to trace the source when she stopped. He was coming to find me, to stop the trial. He was 10 feet from the control room door when something hit him from behind. He never saw who. He never saw who. She looked at her hands. He woke up in a hospital room and was told there had been an accident and that the investigation was already underway. He was handed the preliminary findings before he was fully coherent. His name was on everything. A pause. He said he tried to contest it. He went to the legal team and was told the evidence was conclusive and that any challenge would extend the investigation and harm the company further. He was given a separation agreement with a non-disclosure clause. Her voice stayed even. He was 28. His career in medical technology was effectively over. He took the agreement. Nathan thought about that, the mechanics of it, how someone sophisticated enough to engineer a vehicle accident and compromise an investigation would also have been sophisticated enough to understand that the most vulnerable point in a cover-up was the person who got blamed, and how to handle that person quickly before they had their footing back. "The NDA," he said. "Does it hold against federal investigators?" "NDAs don't preclude cooperation with law enforcement," Vivian said. Claire confirmed that. She looked at Nathan. "He's been carrying this for 3 years. He was 28 and alone, and he had no proof, and the company's legal team had boxed him in, and She stopped herself. "I didn't call him." "You didn't know." "I know that." She said it without self-pity and without absolution, just factually. Knowing it and living with it are different things. Nathan didn't offer her comfort, because she wasn't asking for comfort, and offering it would have been condescending. He said instead, "What do you need to do before he gets here?" She seemed to appreciate the redirect. Claire is still pulling the financial audit trails. If she finds communication records tying Adrian to Meridian before the formal proposal, she picked up her phone again. "And I need to look at something in the R&D lab. There's a project file for the exoskeleton's current development phase that Adrian has been CT'd on for the past 18 months. I want to know if the technical data in those files matches what we've submitted to the Regulatory Certification Board, or if someone has been feeding modified data upstream." Why would he modify the data? If the certification data is corrupted, the exoskeleton program fails regulatory review. The program fails, the company's primary value proposition collapses, and Meridian's offer becomes the only viable path for the board. She paused. "I've been watching the certification timeline slip for 4 months. Small delays, procedural requests for additional documentation. I thought it was the standard friction of regulatory review." She looked at Nathan. "But if the data being submitted has been altered, someone is engineering the failure," Nathan said. Yes, he thought about the bracket again. The deliberate misalignment, the patience it implied, small adjustments over time accumulating toward a result that looked like a natural process. The same mind that had introduced a remote command to a vehicle's firmware had also been, apparently, introducing small corruptions into a regulatory submission and small mechanical failures into a wheelchair. "How long has Adrian been doing this?" Nathan said. "The accident was 2 years ago," Vivian said. "But the groundwork—" She paused. "The exoskeleton program started producing significant results 3 years ago. My father died 3 years ago. Adrian became acting COO the month after my father's diagnosis." A very long pause. "He's been planning this since before my father was gone." Nathan sat with that. 3 years of someone sitting across a conference table from Vivian Ashcroft, attending her meetings, reviewing her reports, maintaining the surface of professional loyalty, while systematically dismantling everything her father had built and everything she was trying to continue. The patience of it was almost incomprehensible. "He needs to think he's winning," Nathan said. "If he suspects we have the black box data, he'll accelerate the acquisition vote," Vivian said. "He has enough board support to call an emergency shareholders meeting. Claire told me he's been quietly consolidating proxies for the past month." She looked at Nathan steadily. "If he calls that meeting before we have everything in order, the vote goes through and the acquisition is approved, and the legal complications of reversing it are significant. How much time do we have?" "If he's watching the Quincy access logs," Claire said, "a day, maybe 2. She put her phone down. "But if he looks at the R&D data access and sees that I've been in the certification files," Nathan's phone buzzed. He looked at it. "Unknown number, Providence area code." He frowned. "Cole," he said. The voice on the other end was male, mid-30s, the tone of someone who had been rehearsing whether to make this call and had finally decided. "Is this the man Vivian Ashcroft has been working with? I spoke with her an hour ago. She gave me this number." "Daniel Marsh," Nathan said. A pause. "Yes." "You said you'd be here by 6. "I said that." Another pause. "I've been sitting in my car outside my apartment for 30 minutes. I need to know—" He stopped. "How much does she know about what actually happened?" "She knows about the command injection in the vehicle telemetry. She knows about your credentials not being on the login. She knows you found the network anomaly before the trial." The silence on the other end was long enough that Nathan thought the call had dropped. "I tried to tell her," Daniel said finally. "After, when I was still in the hospital. I asked to see her, and they said she was in surgery, and then she was in ICU, and then she was in rehabilitation, and I had the findings in front of me with my name on them and no proof of anything, and every day I waited felt like another day I was choosing not to fight it." His voice was rough. "And then I sent the letter and she didn't respond, and I thought she believed what the report said." "She didn't," Nathan said. "She believed it because she didn't have reason not to, and that's different." Another silence. "Is she— How is she?" Nathan looked across the desk at Vivian, who was watching him with an expression that was careful and waiting. "She's the CEO of a medical technology company that's 18 months from bringing something significant to market," he said. "She's dealing with a lot of things at once. She could use your help." A shorter pause this time. "I'll be there by 5. He hung up. Vivian was still watching him. "He's coming earlier," Nathan said. She nodded. She looked at the photograph of her father on the shelf and then back at Nathan. "I owe you an apology," she said. "For what?" "For the terrace, the night we met." She paused. "You said the view was beautiful, and I said something unkind about it." Nathan thought back. "Beauty only reminds people I can no longer walk." "You didn't owe a stranger a pleasant response." "No, but I owe you honesty." She looked at him squarely. "I was rude because I was tired and because I'd been performing composure for 4 hours, and you were the last person I had to perform it for before I could be alone, and I took that out on you." A pause. "That's not who I try to be." "You were having a hard night." "I have a lot of hard nights," she said. "It's not an excuse." "I didn't take it as an insult," Nathan said. "I took it as someone telling the truth about something that hurt." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and pulled up the R&D file directory and went back to work, because she was a person who processed things by continuing to move, and he was beginning to understand that about her. He stayed at the desk and waited because that was what was needed. Claire called at 2:40 with the financial audit trails. She had found what she was looking for, a series of wire transfers from a subsidiary account linked to Meridian Global's North American operations, made to a shell company incorporated in Delaware 3 years ago. The shell company had a listed director whose name meant nothing until Claire cross-referenced it against the building security system and found that the same name appeared as an authorized contact for Adrian Locke's personal account with the company's HR records. An alias, or a family member, or both. Claire said her financial forensics contact would need another 48 hours to fully trace the corporate structure. 48 hours they might not have. Daniel arrived at 4:57. He was thinner than his company photo had suggested and had the particular quality of someone who had been waiting for something for a long time and was not sure what to do now that it was arriving. He shook Nathan's hand and then looked at Vivian and didn't say anything for a moment. And Vivian looked at him and didn't say anything either. And Nathan found something else to look at for that particular beat of time. What they said to each other in the first minute was private and clipped and insufficient for what it was trying to carry, which was probably appropriate, because some things need to be said inadequately before they can be said at all. Then they got to work. Daniel sat across from Claire and Nathan at the conference table and walked them through everything he'd found before the accident, the network anomaly, the access log, the test command that had been run at 3 in the morning. He had kept notes, not official records. He'd been told those were company property and had surrendered them under the separation agreement, but personal notes, written the night before the trial in a notebook he'd kept in his apartment and had been carrying with him since. He slid the notebook across the table, and Claire picked it up without speaking. The command that was run at 3 a.m. was a dry test of the override protocol, Daniel said. I didn't understand what it meant at the time. It looked like a system calibration, but the credentials used were wrong. It was flagged as an administrative access, but the user behavior didn't match any of the facility's documented system administrators. He paused. I spent 2 days trying to trace it. I got as far as identifying the access origin terminal. It was a workstation on the executive observation level. He paused. Adrian Locke's designated workstation. Vivian looked at Claire. Combined with the black box telemetry, Claire said carefully, this builds a case. She set the notebook down. It's not sufficient on its own, but with the telemetry data, the financial records, and the access logs, this is sufficient to bring to federal investigators and request an injunction against the acquisition pending investigation. How long does an injunction take? Nathan said. Emergency filing given the acquisition timeline? We could have a temporary restraining order within 24 hours if the right judge reviews it. Claire looked at the table. The problem is that Adrian will know the moment the filing is made. He monitors company legal activity. He'll call the shareholders meeting the same day, Vivian said, before the TRO is issued. Then we need to be ready to present this at the meeting itself, Nathan said. Everyone looked at him. He realized he'd said it with a certainty that was slightly ahead of a plan. He thought about what they had, the telemetry data, the financial records, the access logs, Daniel's notebook, the photographs of the wheelchair. Separately, each piece was significant. Together, they told a story that was difficult to refute. If Adrian calls the meeting, Nathan said, he'll be expecting Vivian to be on the defensive. He'll have proxies lined up. He'll have a presentation. He looked at Vivian. He won't expect you to walk in with the black box data. He'll try to discredit it, Vivian said, claim the unit was tampered with. Dr. Okafor can testify to the chain of custody, Claire said slowly. The seal was intact. The forensic interface prevented write operations. The telemetry data has an internal timestamp signature that predates any access by our team. She was thinking out loud, the legal architecture assembling in real time. It's defensible. It's more than defensible, Daniel said. The access log credentials in the black box, Adrian's user ID is the only one that can't be attributed to normal operations. Every other administrative login that day has a corresponding facility record. His doesn't. There was no authorized reason for him to access the equipment management system remotely during an active trial. He paused. That's a specific piece. It has no innocent explanation. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, Boston was doing what it did in the late afternoon in October. The light going low and amber, the harbor darkening, the city settling into its evening posture. Nathan thought about Adrian Locke, somewhere in this building or somewhere in the city, watching access logs and monitoring legal filings and proxy counts, building toward a conclusion he'd been engineering for 3 years with the patience of someone who believed he was the most careful person in any room he entered. He thought about the bracket on the wheelchair, the careful, deliberate angle of it, designed to fail at the right moment under the right conditions. Adrian Locke was careful. He was patient. He understood systems. But he had not, apparently, accounted for a man who repaired mobility equipment in Dorchester finding a mechanical defect on a hotel terrace because he couldn't look at a chair that wasn't right and simply keep walking. Nathan's phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text from Mrs. Chen. "Lily wants to know if you're coming for dinner." I made her put the question in her own words. The original version had more opinions about your schedule. He showed it to no one and typed back, "Tell her I'll be there by 7. Tell her I'm sorry." Mrs. Chen replied, "She says okay, but she wants to hear about it." He put the phone in his pocket and looked up at the table. Claire was already drafting the emergency filing language. Daniel was cross-referencing his notebook against the financial records. Vivienne was on the phone with Dr. Okafor, confirming the chain of custody documentation. He sat forward and started helping, because 7 o'clock was still several hours away and there was work to do. What he didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that Adrian Locke had checked the Quincy storage logs that afternoon at 2:15 and had seen the disposition assessment entry and had found the employee ID that didn't match any internal staff and had spent the 40 minutes since sitting in his office on the 16th floor working through the same sequence of connections they were working through, arriving at the same conclusion from the other direction, and that he had already made one phone call and was about to make another. The call Adrian Locke made that evening was to a man named Ferris, who worked for a private security firm that Ashcroft Mobility had contracted for facility management at 3 of its secondary locations, including Quincy. The second call was to someone at Meridian Global, whose name never appeared in any company record because some relationships are maintained entirely off the books, and everyone involved understands that is the point. Both calls were brief. Adrian was the kind of man who did not say more than was necessary on any communication channel, which was a discipline he'd developed over 3 years of operating carefully inside an institution he was simultaneously trying to destroy. What he told Ferris was simple. The Quincy facility had been accessed by an unauthorized contractor and certain equipment had been removed under a fraudulent assessment order. He wanted it retrieved before morning. What he told Meridian was simpler: accelerate the timeline. The vote needed to happen within 48 hours or the window would close. Then he sat in his office on the 16th floor and looked at the harbor and thought about contingencies, the way he always thought about contingencies, which was methodically and without sentiment. He did not know about Daniel Marsh yet. That would come later and it would change his calculations significantly. But for now, he was operating on the assumption that Vivienne had a mechanic with a black box and an attorney with access to financial records, and that the correct response was speed. He had enough board proxies. He'd been collecting them for 6 months, quietly, through the specific social machinery of men who believed they were making a prudent business decision and who would be sincerely surprised to learn they were also providing cover for a 10-year fraud. 4 board members committed, 2 more persuadable on the day if the framing was right. Vivienne had Claire in a minority position. The numbers were not close. He sent the emergency shareholders meeting notice at 9:17 p.m., citing material corporate developments requiring immediate board action. Under the company's articles of incorporation, 48 hours notice was sufficient for an emergency convening. The meeting was set for Friday morning at 10. His assistant sent the formal notice to all board members and required parties at 9:18, so Vivienne received it at 9:19. She called Nathan at 9:22. He was at his kitchen table with Lily's drawings spread in front of him. She'd left 4 new ones on his workbench during the week, apparently, and had collected them on his desk with a note that said, "These are from this week in case you missed them." And he was looking at them with the particular quality of attention that comes when you realize you'd been so inside something that you'd been moving through your own life at a slight remove. He picked up on the second ring. He called the meeting, Vivienne said. Friday, 10 a.m. Nathan looked at the drawings. A narwhal. A house that was their apartment with a flag on it for no discernible reason. a person he thought was supposed to be him based on the tool belt. A dog, which they did not have, and which Lily had been campaigning for with the methodical persistence of someone who understood that the first step to getting what you want is making it impossible to pretend you don't want it. "How much time does Claire need?" he said. "She says the emergency injunction filing can be ready by 8 a.m. if she works through the night. But the TRO won't be issued before the meeting regardless. Not with that timeline. So we walk in and present what we have. We walk in and present what we have." A pause. Adrian controls 4 votes. He needs 2 more for a majority. The undecided members are Hartwell and Cho. Both of them are risk-averse. Both of them have been told for 6 months that the exoskeleton timeline is slipping and the certification outlook is uncertain. Another pause. Adrian's been managing that narrative very carefully. What does Hartwell care about most? A brief silence. Liability. He's been on 3 boards where regulatory failures created personal legal exposure. He hates it. He talks about it constantly. And Cho? Legacy. She was a friend of my father's. She cares about what the company was built to do. Vivian paused. She's been leaning toward the acquisition because she thinks it gives the exoskeleton program a path to market through Meridian's distribution network, even though Meridian would shelf it. She doesn't know that. She's been told by Adrian that Meridian is committed to the program's completion. A pause. She trusts what she's been told because she trusted Adrian. Nathan looked at the drawing of the house with the flag. The black box data is the center. Everything else is context. If we lead with the telemetry, the command injection, Adrian's user ID, the timestamp, that's the thing that doesn't have an innocent explanation. Hartwell sees it, and he's looking at criminal liability for anyone who proceeds with an acquisition while that evidence is on the table. Cho sees it, and she understands the exoskeleton program was never at risk from the market. It was at risk from inside the building. Vivian was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about it for 2 hours," he said. "I could be wrong about the framing." "You're not wrong." A pause that had a different texture than her usual pauses. "Your daughter, is she there?" "She's asleep. She left me drawings to catch up on." "What are they of?" He looked at the dog. "Mostly a campaign for a pet we don't have." Something in Vivian's voice shifted into something quieter and more real than her operational register. "She sounds like she makes her case well." "She makes it constantly and specifically," he said. "Last week she presented a written list of responsibilities she would personally assume. It had 7 items and a signature line." 7-year-olds with signature lines, Vivian said softly. "Your father must have been something." "My father left when I was 9, Nathan said. "She gets it from somewhere else." A beat of silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that happens when something true lands between 2 people and they're both sitting with it. "Get some sleep," Vivian said finally. "I need you sharp tomorrow." "What about you?" "I don't sleep well before things like this," she said. "I never have. That's not a reason not to try." "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." Another pause. "Thank you, Nathan." For the drawings comment. He wasn't sure which comment she meant, but he said goodnight and hung up and sat for another few minutes with Lily's drawings before he put them away carefully and went to bed. He was at the Seaport building at 8:15. Claire was already there, running on no visible sleep, and the specific energy of someone who had converted stress into forward motion through long professional practice. She had the injunction filing ready, a physical binder of evidentiary documentation organized by category, and a 4-page executive summary of the evidence narrative that she'd written with the precise economy of someone who had presented complex cases to skeptical audiences for 40 years. Daniel was there too, which Nathan hadn't expected. He was standing at the window of the conference room with a coffee, looking at the harbor the way people look at things when they're trying to locate their own steadiness. "You didn't have to come," Nathan said. "I know." Daniel turned from the window. He looked like he hadn't slept either, but there was something in his face that hadn't been there yesterday. Some quality of having made a decision and being past the point of revisiting it. "I want to be in the room." "Adrian will see you." "Yes." Daniel looked at him steadily. That's the point. Vivienne arrived at 8:45. She'd dressed carefully, not formally, but with a deliberateness that communicated something without announcing it. She went through the evidence binder with Claire for 20 minutes with the focused attention of someone who was going to need to speak to every piece of it under adversarial conditions and needed to own it completely rather than just understand it. She marked 2 sections and asked Claire to reorganize the sequencing slightly, leading with the financial records before the telemetry rather than after, because the financial records established motive and the telemetry established method. And in her experience, people needed to understand why before they could fully absorb how. Claire reorganized it without argument because the instinct was right. At 9:40, they took the elevator to the top floor boardroom. The boardroom of Ashcroft Mobility Systems was a long room with floor-to-ceiling windows on the harbor side and a mahogany table that seated 16 comfortably. The board members were already arriving when Vivienne's group entered. 4 men and 3 women, ranging in age from early 50s to late 60s, all of them carrying the specific self-possession of people who sat on boards for a living and had developed professional surfaces that were difficult to read. Adrian Locke was at the far end of the table. He was 62, silver at the temples, with the groomed authority of someone who had spent decades cultivating the appearance of being the most reasonable person in any room. He looked at Vivienne when she entered, and his expression did not change, which was itself a kind of tell. He'd been managing this moment in his head and had his face ready for it. He looked at Daniel Marsh and something moved through his eyes quickly and was gone. He looked at Nathan and didn't recognize him, which was not surprising. Nathan Cole was a man who fixed equipment for a living and volunteered at charity galas and did not appear in any professional directory that Adrian Locke would have had reason to consult. He filed Nathan under service staff, which was a mistake, but it was an understandable one. "Ms. Ashcroft," Adrian said, "I'm glad you could be here, though I should note that the terms of this meeting don't require your presence." "They require it as CEO," Vivienne said, moving to her position at the head of the table. "Which I still am." "Of course," Adrian said pleasantly. The board members settled. Hartwell, 70s, heavy-set, the slightly watchful quality of a man who had learned to read rooms, was 3 seats from Adrian. Cho. Vivienne's father's contemporary, silver-haired, with reading glasses perched on her head, was across the table from Hartwell and had looked at Daniel Marsh when she entered with an expression that suggested she recognized him and was recalibrating. Adrian had a presentation ready on the room's display system. He opened with the acquisition proposal's financial case, Meridian's offer, the market analysis, the projected returns against the current program timeline. He spoke with the ease of someone who had prepared this argument many times and believed in its arithmetic, which it occurred to Nathan was probably true. Adrian probably did believe the acquisition made financial sense. The fraud and the conspiracy were means to an end, but the end itself was something he genuinely convinced himself was correct. He spent 12 minutes on the financial case. He spent 4 minutes on the exoskeleton program's timeline issues, citing certification delays and regulatory documentation requests as evidence of structural challenges that a strategic partner like Meridian could help navigate. He spent 3 minutes on what he called leadership continuity, which was the most careful part of his presentation. He never said Vivienne couldn't run the company, but he assembled language around capability and bandwidth and the emotional demands of the past 2 years in a way that said it without saying it, which was more effective and more insulting than saying it directly. He was good at this. Nathan had to concede that. He was articulate and prepared, and he had 4 votes at the table, and the financial numbers were genuinely persuasive on their surface. When Adrian finished, he looked at Vivienne with the expression of someone extending a courtesy. "I'm sure Ms. Ashcroft has some remarks." "I do," Vivienne said. She looked at Nathan. He stood and connected the external drive to the room's display system, replaced Adrian's presentation with the evidence package, and sat back down at the side of the room. He wasn't a board member. He wasn't an attorney. He had no formal standing here and wasn't pretending otherwise. He was the person who had put the documents in order and knew where everything was, and that was sufficient. Vivienne began with the financial records. She didn't editorialize. She walked through the wire transfers, the shell company, the Delaware Incorporation records, the name that linked back to Adrian's personal HR contacts. She spoke in the even, factual register of someone presenting data rather than making an argument, and the room was very quiet as she did it. Adrian interrupted at the third slide. "These records are being presented without context," he said. "The shell company you're describing has no verified connection to me." "The verified connection is here," Vivian said, and moved to the next slide, which showed the HR file cross-reference Claire had pulled. The listed director of Ashcroft Capital Solutions, LLC, shares a residential address with a family member whose relationship to you is documented in the company's HR conflict of interest disclosures from 6 years ago. The address is current. The disclosure is current. She paused. The wire transfers from Meridian's North American subsidiary to this LLC total $4.3 million over 38 months. The transfers began 8 months before Meridian's formal acquisition offer was presented to this board. Hartwell had his reading glasses on. He was looking at the financial slide the way he looked at things that were making him think about liability, which was with the concentrated attention of someone running probabilities. The financial records establish a relationship between our COO and the acquiring company predating any legitimate negotiation, Vivian continued. They establish financial motive for the acquisition to proceed. What they don't establish on their own is what was done to make it inevitable. She looked at Nathan again. He moved to the next section of the presentation. The telemetry data from the black box was on screen. The same visualization Dr. Okafor had shown them in the lab, with timestamp and the command injection plotted clearly. Vivian walked through it with the same even delivery, but the room's quality of attention had shifted now. There is a particular silence that occurs when people begin to understand something they don't want to understand, and it had settled over the boardroom table with a weight that was different from the earlier quiet. She explained the command injection. She explained the simultaneous override of both brake systems. She explained that this was inconsistent with a cascade firmware failure and consistent with deliberate remote access. She showed the access credentials associated with the override command. Adrian's user ID. Adrian had been very still since the financial records. He remained still now. But Nathan, watching him from the side of the room, saw something shift in the quality of his stillness. It had been controlled, the stillness of someone managing a situation. Now it was something else, the stillness of someone whose next move had not yet arrived. "This data is forensically compromised," Adrian said. "The unit has been in external custody. The seal on the unit was intact," Vivian said. "Documented by Dr. Priya Okafor of Veriton Digital Forensics, who performed the extraction using a write-protected forensic interface. The chain of custody is documented from the moment the unit was removed from our Quincy facility under a legitimate disposition assessment order through transport to the lab, and the internal timestamp signatures on the telemetry data predate any access by our team by 2 years." She paused. "Dr. Okafor is available to testify to this. Her documentation is in the binder in front of each of you." Cho had her reading glasses on now, too. She was looking at the telemetry slide and then at Adrian and then back at the slide. "Vivian," Cho said. Her voice was quiet. "The accident." "Yes," Vivian said. "The accident." She moved to the next section. The surveillance footage from the Quincy facility's internal cameras, not from the test floor, where the footage had been corrupted, but from the corridor outside the control room, which ran on a separate system that Adrian had apparently not known about or not considered worth targeting. Claire had pulled it from the secondary system with governance access. The footage was grainy and time-stamped. It showed Daniel Marsh moving quickly down the corridor toward the control room door at 11 minutes and 29 seconds into the trial, 14 seconds before the override command was sent. It showed a figure stepping out from the alcove beside the control room door and striking him from behind. It showed Daniel falling. It showed the figure returning to the alcove. The figure's face was not visible, but the build was specific. And Adrian Locke, 10 feet away at the boardroom table, had the specific build of a man who had been athletic in his 50s and had not entirely lost it, and every person in the room was doing the same calculation. "This footage was recovered from the facility's secondary camera system," Vivian said. "The primary system for the control room corridor was corrupted before the investigation team arrived. The secondary system, which covers the approach corridor, operates on a separate power and storage circuit." The investigation team's scope did not include secondary system review. A pause. Which was perhaps convenient for someone. Adrian said, "This is circumstantial." "It is," Vivian said. "In isolation, it's circumstantial. Combined with the financial records, the telemetry data, the access credentials, and the testimony of the man standing in the doorway." She nodded toward the entrance. Every head in the room turned. Daniel Marsh was standing at the threshold of the boardroom. He had not sat down. He was standing in the doorway with his notebook in his hand and the look of someone who had rehearsed what he was going to say for 3 years without knowing when he was going to say it, and who had now arrived at the moment and discovered that the rehearsal didn't fully prepare you for the room. He looked at Adrian Locke for a long moment. "I found the network anomaly on a Tuesday night," Daniel said. "I ran the access log trace and I identified the workstation it originated from. I was going to bring it to you directly." He said this to Vivian, not to the room, but the room was listening. I couldn't have imagined." He stopped. "I was in that corridor because I was trying to stop the trial. I had 14 seconds. Someone made sure I didn't have 14 seconds. He set the notebook on the table and slid it toward Claire without taking his eyes off Adrian. "I have the original access log entries from the 2 days before the accident," he said. "Handwritten copies made the night before the trial when I was still trying to understand what I was looking at. The user ID matches what you've shown from the black box." He paused. "I lost 2 years of my career in my relationship and—" His voice caught briefly and then steadied. "I lost a lot of things. I want them on the record." The room was absolutely still. Adrian looked at the table. Nathan watched him make a calculation. The kind of calculation that happens when a structure you've built over years suddenly has too many points of failure to manage simultaneously. He saw Adrian's jaw tighten slightly. He saw him look at the 4 board members he controlled and then look away. What Nathan did not see coming was Reeves. Marcus Reeves was Adrian's longest-standing ally on the board, a real estate developer who had been one of Edward Ashcroft's early investors and who had been backing Adrian's consolidation quietly for 18 months. He was 64 and had the look of someone who had always chosen the most profitable side of any disagreement and had generally been correct. He was looking at the financial records in the binder in front of him with the expression of someone doing a different kind of calculation than the rest of the room. "Adrian," Reeves said. Adrian looked at him. "The Meridian subsidiary payments." Reeves tapped the binder. "My firm has a minority stake in that subsidiary. I disclosed that stake when Meridian's acquisition offer was first presented, and I was told the offer had originated through legitimate channels." He paused. "If these financial records are accurate, I was used as insulation. My disclosed relationship with a subsidiary was used to make the acquisition look like a coincidence of investment interests rather than a manufactured outcome." He paused again, longer. "I have personal legal exposure here that I did not create and did not consent to." The silence after this was a different kind than any that had come before it. "Marcus," Adrian started. "Don't," Reeves said flatly. "Don't talk to me right now." He closed his binder and looked at Vivian. "What do you need from me?" Vivian looked at him steadily. "Your account of the communications you've had with Adrian regarding the acquisition timeline and the exoskeleton certification status. I'll have my attorney contact yours by end of day." Nathan watched Adrian Locke absorb this. It was a precise kind of watching, the way Nathan watched things when he was trying to understand how a mechanism failed, which was by paying attention to the moment the structure stopped being able to hold its own weight. Adrian had built this over 3 years with the patience of someone who believed in the architecture he was constructing. He had not built in the possibility that the man he'd framed would walk through a door, or that his own financial instrument would develop independent concerns about personal liability, or that a one-man shop equipment repair contractor from Dorchester would find a mechanical defect on a hotel terrace at 10:30 on a Tuesday night. Small failures, accumulating. Hartwell spoke next, and when Hartwell spoke, the room knew which way it was going because Hartwell had the specific tone of someone removing himself from proximity to a problem. "I want to table the acquisition vote," he said, "pending a full independent review of the evidence presented today and a referral to federal investigators." "Seconded," Cho said, without hesitation. She was looking at Vivian with an expression that was not quite apology, but was something in that direction, a recognition maybe, of what she'd been willing to believe when it was easier. Adrian said nothing. He had the look of a man who understood that the room had tilted past the point where speaking would help him. The vote to table the acquisition was 5-2. The two were the board members most directly in Adrian's orbit, and even they didn't look certain. The vote to place Adrian Locke on immediate administrative suspension, pending investigation, was unanimous, including notably Reeves, who voted with the precision of someone establishing distance. Adrian stood when the suspension was announced. He looked at Vivian, and Nathan thought he might say something. There was a moment where it seemed possible, where the architecture of 3 years wanted some form of acknowledgement, but he didn't say anything. He straightened his jacket, pushed his chair back evenly, and walked out of the boardroom with the composure of someone who has decided the only dignity available is not providing a scene. The door closed behind him. The room breathed. The federal referral was made before noon. Claire had her contacts at the U.S. Attorney's office, and she made the call from the hallway outside the boardroom, with the direct efficiency of someone who had prepared for this call in advance. The forensic documentation went with it. Dr. Okafor's chain of custody report, the telemetry extraction, the financial records, the surveillance footage, Daniel's notebook. By 2 o'clock, Vivian had convened a brief session with the board's remaining members and confirmed her authority as CEO, pending the completion of an independent governance review, which was a formality that everyone understood was a formality and which was necessary anyway because institutions require their formalities to function. Cho asked to speak with her privately and did so for 15 minutes in Vivian's office while Nathan and Daniel waited in the conference room and didn't talk much. "How are you doing?" Nathan said at one point. Daniel looked at the table. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I've been carrying the version of events where I was the one who failed for 3 years. I know intellectually that the version just changed, but the new version hasn't. It doesn't feel real in the same way yet." Nathan nodded. He understood that. Knowing a thing and the thing feeling true were different processes and ran on different timelines. "It will," he said. "It takes longer than a day." Daniel looked at him. "You've been doing this since the gala." "A wheelchair bracket," Nathan said. "That's where it started." "That seems—" Daniel paused. "That seems like an incredibly small thing for how much has changed." "Most things start small," Nathan said. "The question is whether you're the kind of person who can keep looking at it once you've seen it." Daniel considered this for a moment. "Are you?" Nathan thought about the $47 in checking and the shop lease and Mrs. Chen putting Lily to bed 4 nights this week because he hadn't been home by bedtime. He thought about the tool bag he'd brought to the garage 2 weeks ago that had launched everything that followed. He thought about what it cost to keep looking, and whether the cost was different from the cost of not looking, and whether those two things balanced the way he'd always hoped they did. "I'm working on it," he said. Vivian came back from her office with Cho, who said a few words to Daniel that were private enough that Nathan stepped away. He stood at the window and looked at the harbor and thought about nothing in particular, which was a relief. When Cho left, Vivian came to stand beside him at the window. She looked out at the water for a moment without speaking. "She thought she was doing the right thing," Vivian said. "For the company. For my father's legacy. She believed what she'd been told." "People usually do," Nathan said. "That's not an excuse." "No," he said. "But it is an explanation. They're different things." Vivian looked at the harbor. Below them, the seaport was doing its mid-afternoon business. Ferries, delivery trucks, people moving in the particular directed way of a city with things to do. Normal, ordinary, unremarkable, in the way that normal days always are when they're happening and almost never feel like afterward. "My father's name is on the founding documents of this company," Vivian said. When the investigation found Daniel at fault, there was a subtext, a narrative that the accident happened because standards had slipped, because the culture he'd built wasn't rigorous enough. I heard it in the way people phrased their sympathy. She paused. It wasn't true, but I couldn't prove it wasn't true. And so I carried it along with everything else. Nathan looked at her profile. "It wasn't true," he said, "and now there's a record that it wasn't true." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Then there is." It was not a dramatic exchange. It was two people at a window in the late afternoon looking at a harbor saying plain things. But Nathan had learned, was still learning, that plain things said at the right moment carried more weight than elaborate ones, and that the moments that actually changed something rarely announced themselves as moments. His phone buzzed. Mrs. Chen. She's asking if you're bringing dinner or if I should make the pasta. He typed back. Tell her I'll bring dinner. I'll be there by 6:30. Mrs. Chen. She says okay, and also she wants to discuss something with you about a dog. I have to go get my daughter, Nathan said. Vivienne turned from the window. Yes, go. Are you all right? She considered the question without deflecting it, which he'd come to understand was how she handled questions she respected. I'm better than I was this morning, she said. I'm worse than I'll be in a month. That seems like a reasonable place to be. That's an accurate assessment. I'm accurate about most things, she said, just not always in time. He picked up his jacket and his bag. Daniel was on the phone in the corner of the conference room, talking quietly, and Nathan caught his eye and nodded on the way out. Daniel nodded back. A particular nod. The kind between people who have been through something together without having had much time to establish the relationship that the experience implied. In the elevator, Nathan looked at his reflection in the brushed steel door and thought he looked approximately like a man who had been running on inadequate sleep and gas station coffee for several days, which was accurate. He thought about the bracket, the beginning of all of this, the small misalignment that shouldn't have been there, in a chair that someone had serviced for a woman who used it every day. He thought about the patience it took to introduce that kind of damage and the patience it had taken to trace it back. And he thought that patience was probably the thing that distinguished outcomes more than anything else, in the end. Not brilliance, not resources. The willingness to stay in a problem until it yielded. The elevator opened to the lobby. He walked past the display cases with the mobility prototypes and the framed technical drawings that someone had spent a career making beautiful, and he pushed through the front door into the October air of the Seaport District, which was cold in the specific Boston way that had stopped being notable after the first week of fall and had simply become the ambient condition of the season. He drove to Dorchester. He picked up food from the Thai place on Savin Hill that Lily approved of because they gave her extra peanut sauce without her having to ask, which she considered a mark of an establishment with good values. He parked in front of Mrs. Chen's building and sat in the truck for 60 seconds doing nothing, which was the decompression he gave himself when he'd been fully inside something and needed to come back out of it before walking through a door into his actual life. Then he got out and got the food and rang the bell. Lily answered because she had been watching for the truck from the window, which she always did and which she would deny if asked. You look tired, she said. I am tired. Did something hard happen? Several things, he said, but they're mostly resolved now. She considered this with the gravity she brought to information that seemed important. Is everyone okay? He thought about Vivienne at the window, Daniel on the phone, Claire filing a federal referral in a corridor, Adrian Locke walking out of a boardroom with his jacket straight and nothing left. Getting there, he said. Lily accepted this and took the food bag and went to tell Mrs. Chen he was here, and Nathan stood in the doorway for a moment longer and let the ordinary weight of his life settle back around him, which was, he'd learned this slowly over years, not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole thing. The federal investigation took 4 months and 11 days, which Nathan knew because he'd been counting without meaning to, the way you count things that are unresolved and living in the back of your attention even when the front of your attention is occupied with other things. Adrian Locke was indicted on 7 counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, and criminal tampering with safety-critical equipment. The indictment was 43 pages and included the black box telemetry, the financial records, the surveillance footage, Daniel's notebook, and the testimony of 2 Meridian Global employees who had decided, once federal investigators were in the room, that their loyalty to a failed scheme had a finite value. Reeves cooperated fully and received a negotiated resolution that cost him significantly, but kept him out of a courtroom as a defendant, which was what he'd been purchasing with his cooperation, and everyone understood that. The investigation also found that the company appointed to run the original accident inquiry had received consulting fees from Meridian totaling $800,000 During the period of the investigation, which added obstruction of justice to the list of problems and brought 2 additional defendants into the indictment. The investigation took 4 months. The trial took 3 more. Adrian was convicted on 5 of 7 counts. He stood for sentencing in a federal courtroom in Boston on a gray February morning and said nothing when given the opportunity to address the court, which was perhaps the most honest thing he'd done in years. The sentence was substantial. His attorney filed notice of appeal before the week was out, which was expected and which Claire said would go nowhere given the evidence record. Vivian was in the courtroom. She sat in the gallery with Claire on one side and Daniel on the other, and Nathan was beside Daniel because there had been, over the past months, a gradual accretion of occasions that had put them in the same rooms, and they had arrived at something that functioned like friendship without either of them having explicitly agreed to it. Men of a certain disposition often form that kind of thing, built from shared work and shared stress and the specific shorthand of people who went through something together and survived it roughly. When the verdict was read, Vivian sat very still. Then she put her hand over Claire's for a moment, briefly, and then took it back. That was all. There was no dramatic exhale, no visible release of something long held. Nathan had expected more from the moment, and then understood, watching her, that she had spent 7 months in a sustained state of forward motion, and that the verdict was a data point in that motion rather than its conclusion. The conclusion was not a courtroom in February. The conclusion was something she was still building. Outside the courthouse, in the cold, she stood beside Nathan on the steps while Claire spoke with the federal prosecutor and Daniel took a phone call. "How do you feel?" Nathan asked. She thought about it honestly. "Tired," she said. "And correct. Which is a strange combination." "You were always correct." "I know. But being correct and being able to prove it are different things, and for 3 years I only had one of them." She pulled her coat tighter against the February air. "My father used to say that justice was the thing you worked toward because the alternative was worse, not because it always arrived on time." She paused. "He was right about that. It arrived late. But it arrived." Nathan looked at the street. A cab went by. A woman walked a dog with a plaid coat on, which made him think of Lily and her 7-item responsibility list. "How's the certification review going?" he said. Something in Vivian's expression shifted into the register she reserved for work. Focused, specific, oriented. "We submitted the corrected documentation to the regulatory board in November. The review panel confirmed last week that the earlier delays were attributable to data inconsistencies in the submissions, which have now been resolved." A pause. "We have a projected certification date in late spring." "Late spring?" Nathan said. 16 weeks, roughly. If the panel doesn't find new issues, which they won't, because the data is clean, and the engineering is sound, and it was always sound." She said the last part with a quiet flatness that was not arrogance, but the simple assertion of someone who had watched other people cast doubt on something they knew was true and was done accommodating that doubt. "We've also restructured the board, 3 new independent members. Claire chairs the governance committee." A pause. "It's a different company than it was last October." "Better?" "Slower," she said. "More careful, which is the same thing in this field." She looked at him sideways. "You've been part of that." He looked at her. "I fixed a bracket." "You did considerably more than that." "The bracket was the thing that mattered," he said. "Everything else followed from someone seeing what was wrong and deciding not to keep walking." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I owe you something I haven't said properly." "You don't owe me anything." "Nathan." She said it in the tone she used when she was about to be direct and wanted him to hear it without deflection. "You found something in the dark on a hotel terrace, and you followed it all the way to a federal courtroom. You were in a facility where someone tried to destroy evidence with you inside it. You did all of this for what? Because it was wrong? Because you couldn't put it down?" "Both of those things," he said. "Both of those things," she repeated. "That's not nothing. That's not a small thing that anyone would do." She looked at him. "I needed you to know that I know that." He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the street and the cab and the dog and the plaid coat and the February sky over Boston, which was the particular flat white of a winter that had been going on long enough to be ordinary. "You're welcome, Sil," he said. She almost smiled. That's the first time you've accepted it. I'm working on that too, he said. Spring arrived late, which it always did in Boston. And when it arrived all at once. 1 week of gray and cold, and then suddenly everything was different in the way that seasons change when you're not quite watching. Nathan noticed it the morning he drove to work and found himself with the window down without having made a decision to open it. The shop in Dorchester was the same as it had always been. Too cold in winter, now veering toward warm, the smell of machine oil and the organized clutter of a one-man operation that had more clients than it had space for. He'd taken on an apprentice in January, a 23-year-old named Marco, who had good hands and a tendency to ask questions before doing things, which Nathan considered a significant professional virtue and had said so explicitly on the first day. Marco had looked slightly surprised to be told that asking questions was a virtue, which told Nathan something about the environments he'd worked in before. The client list had grown, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, in the way that quiet competence tends to accumulate reputation without advertising. Several referrals had come from Ashcroft Mobility's patient network, people who used the company's devices and had been directed to Nathan's shop by someone in the patient services division. He hadn't asked Vivian about it, and she hadn't mentioned it, which suggested it had happened organically through the network itself, people telling other people about a man who saw things and fixed them right. He didn't think about the money constantly, which was new. The lease was covered. Marco's wages were covered. There was something past $47 in checking. He thought about his father occasionally, the way you think about the people who shaped you by their absence as much as their presence, the negative space of someone who wasn't there teaching you, by default, what you didn't want to become. His father had been a man who couldn't stay. Nathan had become, without planning it, a man who couldn't leave, who couldn't walk past a broken thing without fixing it, who couldn't see an injustice without following it, who had raised a daughter alone and built a business alone and then walked into the orbit of a conspiracy that wasn't his problem and treated it like it was. He thought sometimes about whether that was virtue or compulsion. He hadn't resolved it. He suspected the honest answer was that it was both, and that most of the things people called virtues were compulsions that happened to be directed at useful ends. Lily turned 8 in April. She had by then been introduced to Vivian on 3 separate occasions. Once when Vivian came to the shop to have a brake cable adjusted, and Lily happened to be there after school. Once at a company event that Nathan attended and that Lily attended because Mrs. Chen had a doctor's appointment, and once at a dinner that Nathan had described to himself as a working dinner, and which Lily had correctly identified as a different kind of thing. The third occasion was the one that mattered. Lily had sat across from Vivian at a restaurant table in the South End and had asked her, within the first 10 minutes, whether it was hard to drive a wheelchair and whether the wheelchair had a name. Vivian had said that it wasn't hard once you learned it, the same way anything mechanical wasn't hard once you understood how it worked, and that the wheelchair did not have a name, but that if it did, it would probably be something competent and reliable. Lily had suggested Gerald, after the man who came to Nathan's shop every 3 months and told the patio story, because she'd met Gerald once and considered him competent and reliable. Vivian had said Gerald was an excellent suggestion. After that, Lily had asked questions about the exoskeleton program for 45 minutes, with a focused curiosity that Nathan recognized as the same thing she brought to narwhal classification and the correct loading of a dishwasher, and Vivian had answered every question directly and without condescension, which Lily noticed and appreciated in the way children notice when adults take them seriously. In the car on the way home, Lily had said, "She's very smart." "She is," Nathan said. "She talks to me like I'm a person." "You are a person." "I know that," Lily said, with the patience of someone correcting an obvious error. "But not all adults know that." Nathan drove and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "What did you think of her, overall?" Lily considered this with genuine seriousness, looking out the window at the passing streetlights. "I think she's been through something hard," she said, "but she doesn't want you to feel bad about it. She just wants you to know she can handle things." A pause. "I think that's kind of lonely." Nathan looked at the road. "Yeah," he said. "I think you're right." The certification came through on a Thursday in late May. Nathan heard about it from Vivian directly, a text message at 7:43 in the morning. It cleared. Launch date confirmed for September. I thought you should know first. He read it standing in the shop before Marco arrived, with a coffee that was better than gas station quality because he'd bought an actual coffee maker for the workbench in February, which Lily had pointed out was a meaningful upgrade in his self-regard. He typed back, "Congratulations." "Your father would have said something specific and argumentative about it." She replied, "He would have said the regulatory timeline was 18 months too long and then argued about it at length while being obviously proud." A pause, then, "Yes." He put the phone in his pocket and went to work. Thus, the launch event was in September at the Ashcroft Mobility Systems headquarters in the seaport. Not the boardroom, the atrium, which had been cleared and fitted with displays showing the exoskeleton system's development timeline, patient testimony videos, and engineering documentation that had been made legible to a non-technical audience without being simplified into dishonesty. Several hundred people were there: patients, families, clinicians, regulatory officials, investors, journalists. The kind of event that had weight in both of the universes Nathan had identified at the Hargrove Gala, the one where it was genuinely significant, and the one where people came to be seen at something significant. Both universes were present, and on this occasion Nathan found he minded the second one less than he normally would have, because the first one was real enough to absorb it. He was there as Director of Safety Innovation, which was a title that had been proposed by Vivian, vetted by Claire, and presented to Nathan in a conversation that he'd pushed back on twice before accepting. The role was what the title said it was: a function within the company dedicated to safety assessment, equipment standards, and patient-facing quality review, drawing on the specific expertise of a man who had spent 6 years understanding how mobility equipment failed and who had a gift for seeing the difference between what was and what should be. He'd kept the shop. Marco ran it now, with Nathan available for complex cases and the client relationships that were specifically his. The arrangement worked because Marco was good and getting better, and because Nathan had been honest with himself that the shop wasn't something he could let go. It was where he'd built himself, in the years after Lily was born and everything else had fallen away. And even if the role at Ashcroft was more stable and more visible, the shop was where he'd learned what he was. Daniel Marsh was at the launch. He'd joined the company's engineering division 3 months earlier, after a conversation with Vivian that Nathan had not been present for and about which neither of them had said much. He was leading a software safety audit team that reviewed the exoskeleton system's firmware with the specific intensity of someone who had learned the hard way what happens when firmware is wrong. His team had found 3 issues in the testing phase: minor, correctable, non-critical, and had fixed all 3 with a thoroughness that Nathan recognized as the work of someone who understood personally what the stakes were. At the event, Vivian spoke. She was not a natural public speaker in the way that some executives are. She didn't have the performative ease of someone who had trained for a stage. She had, instead, the authority of someone who knew exactly what they were talking about and had decided to say it plainly, which is a different kind of gift and ultimately more durable. She talked about her father. She talked about the exoskeleton program's history, the years of development, the accident and its aftermath, the months of uncertainty before the investigation resolved what had happened. She did not say Adrian Locke's name. She referred to the events in the passive voice of official documentation and then moved on. Because the story of this launch was not about what had been done against it, but about what had been built despite everything. She talked about the patients in the clinical trials. She named several of them, with their permission, and described what the system had done for them in specific terms, not the abstracted language of medical capability, but the concrete particulars of lives changed in specific ways. A woman who had attended her daughter's wedding standing. A man who had walked to his kitchen to make his own breakfast for the first time in 4 years. Nathan stood at the back of the atrium and listened, and he thought about what Lily had said in the car. She's been through something hard, but she doesn't want you to feel bad about it. He thought that was exactly right, and that it described something he'd come to understand about Vivian over the months of working alongside her. That her self-sufficiency was not armor, but constitution. She wasn't keeping people at distance because she was afraid. She was simply, fundamentally, a person who processed difficulty by continuing to function, and who had learned the hard way that leaning on people was not always safe. She was learning that it could be, sometimes. Slowly, imperfectly, with the specific awkwardness of someone learning a thing late that others learned young. He was watching that process from a proximity that had its own awkwardness, its own slow negotiation, its own unresolved quality. They were two people who had been through something together and who were trying to figure out what that meant in the ordinary time on the other side of it. And the figuring was not clean or swift or without its frustrated silences and its missed communications and its moments when one of them said something that the other needed a day to process. Real things are like that. That's how you know they're real. Lily was there at the launch because it was a Saturday, and because she had asked to come with a specificity that made clear she understood what she was asking about. She stood beside Nathan during the speech with a focused attention that she brought to things she considered important. And when Vivian described the woman who had attended her daughter's wedding standing, Lily reached up without comment and took Nathan's hand, which she hadn't done in public in 2 years because she was 8. And 8 had its own dignity requirements. He held her hand and didn't say anything about it. After the speech, after the formal program, and the patient demonstrations, and the conversations with regulatory officials and journalists that took up the bulk of the afternoon, the atrium thinned. The catering staff began clearing. The display systems powered down. The 100 small logistical operations of an event's conclusion absorbed the remaining crowd into purposeful motion. Vivian found them near the exit, where Nathan and Lily had been looking at one of the display cases. The exoskeleton system, in its current iteration, the engineering drawings beside it, and beside those a framed photograph of Edward Ashcroft at his workbench in the company's early years, holding a hand-fabricated prototype, and looking at it with the expression of someone who had just solved something and wasn't yet sure it was going to hold. "He always looked at everything like that," Vivian said, coming up beside them, like it had just done something surprising. "Good surprising or bad surprising?" Lily said. Vivian looked at her. "Both. He never completely expected things to work, even when they did. He said certainty made you careless." She paused. "He was right." Lily looked at the photograph for another moment. "He looks like he liked what he did." "He did," Vivian said, "even when it was hard. Maybe especially then." Lily nodded at this with the solemnity of someone filing a piece of information in a significant category, and then she looked at the exoskeleton system in the case and said, "Can you show me how the knee joint works? My teacher said it's hydraulic, but I think it's more complicated than that." Vivian looked at her for a moment with the expression Nathan had seen once before, in the restaurant, when Lily had asked the wheelchair questions. A quality of being genuinely met by someone, which is different from being charmed by someone, and which Vivian was not accustomed to expecting. "It's more complicated than that," Vivian said. She moved toward the display case. "Come here." Nathan stood back and watched them at the case, Vivian pointing out the joint mechanism, Lily asking the specific follow-up questions that indicated she was actually tracking the explanation rather than waiting for her turn to speak, Vivian adjusting her explanation, not by simplifying it, but by finding the angle that matched how Lily was thinking. He watched them and thought about nothing analytical, just watched. He thought about the hotel terrace in October, the skyline, the cold, the forgotten wrap in his hand, a stranger looking at a view she used to run past and didn't anymore. He thought about the small mechanical fact of a bracket, and about how many things had hinged on the fact that he'd looked at it and then said something instead of continuing toward the door. He thought about what it cost to keep looking. He thought that it cost everything, sometimes, and that the everything was worth it if what you were building on the other side was real. He thought about his daughter, who had at age 8 correctly diagnosed the emotional architecture of a woman she'd met 3 times and had reached for his hand during a stranger's story about a wedding. He thought that Lily would probably be fine regardless of what happened, because she had been born with the specific capacity to see people clearly and to respond to what she saw, which was the most useful thing a person could have and which he'd had very little to do with. You could take credit for a lot of things as a parent. That one came from somewhere else. Vivian said something that made Lily laugh. A genuine laugh, unguarded, the kind that comes out before you can manage it. Nathan heard it from across the atrium and felt something settle in his chest that he didn't immediately name. He let it be unnamed for a while. Some things are better as feelings before they're words. Later, months later, in the winter that followed, after the exoskeleton system had been deployed in 14 clinical settings across 6 states, and after Lily had named Vivian's repaired wheelchair Gerald in a ceremony that only Lily considered official, and that both adults had attended with a seriousness they partially meant, Nathan would try to articulate to himself what the past year had been about. He'd come up with different answers at different times. He'd thought it was about justice, and it was. He'd thought it was about a father's legacy, and a woman's stubbornness, and a man carrying the wrong story for 3 years, and it was all of those things too. But the answer he kept returning to, in the early mornings when the shop was cold and Marco wasn't in yet, and he had time to think without the day's structure organizing his thoughts, was simpler than any of that. The world has a lot of broken things in it, brackets misaligned by accident or by malice, systems that fail because no one was watching or because someone was watching with the wrong intentions, people carrying the wrong story because no one had the evidence to give them the right one. The broken things were everywhere and they were permanent. Fix one and another would appear, because that was the nature of things that were built and used and subjected to time and pressure and the decisions of people who sometimes chose poorly. What mattered was whether you were the kind of person who saw the bracket and kept walking, or whether you stopped. Not because stopping was always safe, not because you'd always be right about what you'd seen, or that being right would be sufficient, or that the cost wouldn't sometimes be more than you'd planned to spend, but because a life built on the discipline of looking, of seeing what was wrong and asking whether you could do something about it, was a life that had a spine to it. And lives with spines were the ones that meant something when they were over. Nathan Cole was 32 years old in October when he found the bracket, and he was 33 in the September that followed, and he was not a particularly remarkable man by most measures that the world used to assess remarkability. He had a small business and a daughter who made an argument for a dog with a signature line, and he had slept badly for several months, and had once been locked in an automated testing facility by a man who planned to destroy the evidence inside it and hadn't succeeded. He had not set out to do anything exceptional. He had simply, repeatedly, looked at things that were wrong and declined to pretend they were fine. That was, he thought, probably enough. Not as a legacy or an achievement or a thing to put on a resume, just as a way of being a person, just as the answer, humble and specific, to the question of what you did with the one life you were handed. You looked, you stayed, you built something with whoever showed up and was willing to build alongside you. And if you were lucky, if the bracket was visible in the right light and you happened to be carrying a hex key and you happened to say something instead of keeping quiet, the something you built turned out to be more than you'd been trying to build. It turned out to be a life,